there is an interesting pattern which is unfolding in the plain sight. What we are seeing here, but then it is escaping the public outrage at the national level. So in India, where the population rises about 6 to 7% annually, and therefore the aspirations are growing faster, but then what we are observing is that the schools are disappearing. The cost for education is rising, and also the access to good education is shrinking, it is narrowing. According to me, this is not an administrative change, it is a designed structural movement. It is being made in a particular way that education is being changed in its very shape and form. The institutions are moved away from the general public. So the story of India begins with few contradictions. Between 2017 and 2024, tens of thousands of government schools have vanished from official records. At the same time, millions of children have also dropped out of the formal education system. This all have not raised alarm. This has not created a political reckoning. Instead, this is a language of reform in the education system, which is trying to fill the gap. But if you closely look at this reform, it is revealing a different character, and it is not what it is promised, but it is something that it is producing in India. Education was not always framed as a market in India. It wasn't a commodity. In modern constitutional democracies, it is defined as a right, a public good essential for citizenship, dignity, and the social upliftment of people of India. In India, this commitment was formalized in Article 21A of the Constitution and the Right to Education Act in 2007, I think. And this promised a universal, free and accessible schooling for all under the age of 14. Also, the universities were low in cost and anybody could get admission if they were deserving, but economics was not the restrictive factor. For a brief period from independence, this promise translated into realities. Schools expanded into remote geographies. You would find a small size school in whatever shape and form, but a school in every village. There were enrollments. That's a different story that there were dropouts, but there were enrollments. This system, though highly imperfect, I would say, carried a moral direction of inclusion of all classes of children into school. It was a parental aspiration, but then this has shifted. Policies like these ones, the current one, about school rationalization and then a structural economic reform has been brought into the education system of India in the name of efficiency, in the name of consolidation, rather than bringing schools to the families. So the schools were merged, and what has happened is the distance from home to school, and these are young children who are anyway insecure in this lawless society. So the distance between the school and the families have increased. And what has happened is that the most affected out of the school children are not only just the poor children who have to make an expense to travel to the school, but also the girls. They have now become more insecure and therefore parents are opting to move out. So on paper this looks administrative optimization, but on ground this has changed the entire structure of the Indian society. There is transportation cost that the parents have to now incur because the schools have moved farther away. In many cases, given the first opportunity, the children are dropping out. And on top of it, what's happening is the private education is coming into play. The options are given about the private schools. So if you look from a distance, the state government, the central government of India have moved away from the education system and they have brought in a player in the market, and that is the private educators. And this is the precise moment where the right to education has moved into a commodity, a market. You are going to buy education. If you look at how the education currently is shifting towards, it has created layers. There's a power play. At the top are the elite institutions in all the cities, whether it is A, B or C tier cities. So there are elite institutions which are insulated, which requires a lot of money. They are resource rich. And slowly these institutions are now marketing themselves to be connected to the global institutions, saying there are exchange programs to some European schools and colleges. the foreign boards like Cambridge and IBS, they are coming into these fancy, rich institutions. So in the middle class, because there is an aspiration for education, families are stretching themselves beyond their means. They are taking loans, they are cutting consumption, and they are sacrificing their long-term securities and savings just to secure schooling for their children. Why? Because the private players are giving the top class education while the government is slowly cutting on the education which is cheaper, less expensive. It is not a sudden thing that is happening. It is gradual because the structural shift in India is being planned in the name of economy, in the name of GDP. And this is not new. It is although new in India, but this is not new in the global history. In pre-modern Europe, literacy was controlled by church and aristocrats. They were the people who had big libraries. Church were the center of education and imparting knowledge. So the access of knowledge was restricted not because the books were scarce, but because the power required containment of knowledge and thoughts. So the thoughts were coming out of church in Europe. The arguments were coming out of aristocracy to only suit their purpose. But then, slowly, when the literacy expanded during the era of enlightenment in history, it actually started to destabilize the existing hierarchies. And we see revolutions coming in France, in parts of Europe, where the intellectuals and the people holding the power, like the Pope in Rome, they were challenged. So the lesson is consistent across all societies. When knowledge spreads, the power which is now concentrated in hands of few, that diffuses to common people. And that had happened in India for last 80 years. But then it is understood that in order to consolidate power, the education has to shrink. Therefore, modern systems no longer deny the access to education. It is not an apartheid situation where students, where children are stopped from being educated. They are priced. The barrier of expense, of cost, has slowly been put into the system. Subtle, but then it has become very effective. So why education? This is another part we should all understand, that education possesses a unique economic characteristic. It is absolutely non-negotiable. Families will cut down on consumption. They will delay their healthcare, hospitalization. They will reduce their future savings and security. But they will not easily withdraw from children education. They may take loans, pay high interest. Now look at the British education system. By the time a child graduates from a university, he or she is already in a debt of 50,000 pounds, which is equivalent to roughly 60 lakh rupees in India. Roughly same thing is happening in India also. So that makes education sector an ideal sector for market expansion. And that is what the global players are targeting. And once the private actors enter at scale, the demand will remain constant. In case of India, 6% population growth, the demand is going to increase. And the pricing adjustments can be made easily because education is not negotiable. There is expansion of private schools, followed by the coaching industry and the education tech platforms. We had the case of Baiju. Thank God it is closed now. So they are all a trajectory of the entire education system, an ecosystem which is creating a layer in the Indian society. And somebody has learnt from the European history, from the American history, that if you want to herd the thought process of people, make them dependent, you need to make education expensive. And this is what even the international institutions like Monetary Fund, IMF and World Bank over decades have encouraged governments across the world to reduce public expenditure and increase private participation in social sectors like education, and especially in developing countries. I may sound a little bit basing my arguments on conspiracy theory, but then the facts are in front of the public. If somebody has an counter argument, why education should not be free, should not be cheap, why should it be burden to families, please do come forward and give your arguments. So what this education is also doing to the society is creating a change in the behavior. In late 19th century, if you see industrial societies, access to education and skill formation was often mediated by an employer control system. So workers were trained within their systems and were less likely to challenge them, not out of loyalty, out of dependency. And today, In United States, the rapid rise of student debt over past 3 decades have linked to delayed in life decisions. It had lowered the entrepreneurial skills and risk taking, and it has increased the preference for a more stable employment over uncertain business risk, because they are all dependent now due to the financial load that they have taken for getting themselves educated. So United States, Britain, other countries like India now following the suit. So when the financial pressures are high, people withdraw from day-to-day politics. When the state reduces its role in education, it is not actually reducing its expenditure. It is changing the relationship between the government and the citizens. So today people are coming on streets to protest, not against the government, against the institutions who are charging high fees in India, against those schools and colleges which are charging for the books and the monopolization of the school uniforms and the school books. They are not standing in front of the assemblies, the parliament, to make education more accessible. So the relationship has changed. And now the citizens are not interacting with the government. So there is a complaint process. Citizens go to the schools. They may demand with the local administration. There is a law and order situation, but then there is an element of compliance. And then the parents say that because they cannot spend too much time on the protest, let's make a cut in their savings to get their school, to get their children educated. So there is a change in this behavior, and that is where the problem is. In India, the consequences are grave. If the current trajectory continues, the implication of this expensive education is just not getting limited to education. By 2030, in another 4 to 5 years, there will be disappearance of significant number of government schools and their access to the families. Children would have to travel in expensive buses and transport systems to reach the school. It will redefine how the societies will interact with each other. Parents will be busy transporting their children. Parents will be busy earning for their children. The families will cut down on their future. Families will be poor. They will be sucked out of their savings by the private players in education. And all this because education is the most prized philosophy of a family. Because education is supposed to bring opportunity. So I am not creating an alarm right now, but then I am creating a warning due to the logical extension of what has happened in history of Europe, of the developing society, of the Western societies, of US, and I am extending this logic, this argument to what is currently happening in India. Any government, any politician, any leader who is going to change the structure of education to free education, access to all, will be heavily opposed by people in power. Any politician who talks about free colleges, free universities, like they do it in Germany. The strength of German economy today is because the education is free right until university levels. People are educated. People come on street in order to fight against any injustice. People are more politically aware and active in Germany because the education is free. Therefore, in India, if education is made free by any leader, the power play and the resistance that will come from the private player and the money power, and of course the external factors like the IMF and the World Bank and the global education players like the Cambridge and the Oxfords and the foreign universities who are now opening their shops in India, the pressure is going to be enormous. That's the warning. With those words, I leave you until next week. Stay safe, stay informed, and like the Pope said yesterday, at the end of the day, somebody has to stand up. Bye for now.
Everything's fine on 93.9 Dublin South FM.